Welcome again to the lecture series on the first Iranians. This is the second of the talks, and my title for today is The Making of Great Men, a title that I hope will come to make a little more sense as I proceed. Thank you all for coming, for braving this weather that is, for American standards, totally stereotypical of this part of the world, and yet was actually rarely my experience when I was here, when I was always surprised by the comparative sunshine of the southeast. So let me begin. Across a wide range of media and objects, the Iranian community would produce, over the course of its 4-century history, Iranian aristocrats appear as physically and culturally dominant. In a word, as ontologically superior to all others. Epic literature commonly deployed the metaphor of the cypress tree to capture the superior strength of Iranian males. And accounts of their battling of bears, bulls, and lions finds full visual expression in the silver metalwork typical of the artistic production of the court. And to highlight the final lecture, I'm actually going to return to the production of these silver vessels as an aspect of the festive economy of the court on the 23rd. These aristocrats were known, quite simply, as great men, or big men, as buzurgan in Middle Persian. Their bigness likely corresponded with superior nutrition, resulting in greater stature, and in any case, their travel exclusively on horseback foreclosed any questioning of their grandeur, even among the slightest of aristocrats. Zoroastrian jurists in the service of the court, I will argue today and in the next lecture, produced this ontological chasm separating Iranians from others, beginning already in the course of the 3rd century construction of an Iranian community. They did so by means of a jurisprudential order guaranteeing the power and privileges of the big aristocrats, the buzurgan, or more specifically, those great men who embraced the Iranian identity, as access to the most important juridical institutions was restricted to Zoroastrian Iran, or Iranians, as I've been anglicizing the term. They reproduced aristocratic houses across generations to calcify a stratified social order in accordance with their distinct cosmological concepts and ideals. They accordingly concentrated the primary sources of military and social power around the Iranian court, the scope of whose authorities and the sources of whose power would expand remarkably between the 3rd and the early 7th centuries CE. Today, I'll outline the development of a regime of coercive reproduction as an incentive to aristocratic participation in the Iranian order, and also a means of caging often recalcitrant aristocrats within an imperial order whose institutions became increasingly difficult to escape. And in the next lecture, I'll outline a parallel regime of patrimonial reproduction, a complex of institutions providing a guarantee for the intergenerational transmission of landholdings no less secure than the institutions guaranteeing the production of heirs, and no less an incentive to aristocrats to join an Iranian community that I'd like to emphasize remained very much a proposition, only a possibility in the middle of the 3rd century. That is, to remind those of you who were here for the first lecture, and to clarify for those who were not in attendance, this Iranian identity in the 3rd century was one that no one, in fact, wielded or accepted initially. It's something that is a proposition pitched to aristocrats within a new political community. To recap from the previous lecture, I argued that the early Iranian court pitched this new discourse of Iranian identity to disparate communities of Parthian aristocrats in the decades immediately following its conquest of the Parthian Empire in 224 CE. The term Iran, through the term Iran, the regime invited aristocrats to adopt for themselves entitled its bearers to participation in what were the most important political institutions of the Parthian and Iranian regimes alike. The conduct of military campaigns, particularly against the Romans, and the making and unmaking of kings in aristocratic assemblies. These roles had been traditional aristocratic privileges under the Parthians. The Iranian discourse, however, transformed their significance. According to the ideological framework that the court propagated, to be Iran was to, just a moment. According to the ideological framework the court propagated, to be Iran was to possess the genealogy of the mythical kings and aristocrats of the Zoroastrian Avesta, a mythical, historical, and still oral tradition. In subjugating the Romans, whether physically through military victory or symbolically through the collection of tribute, the 3rd century aristocrats were believed to have reestablished the primordial sovereignty of a mythical people. And their victories across the 3rd century affirmed the truth of the court's hubristic claim to represent the historical manifestation of the ancient rulers of Zoroastrian myth. The court also reinterpreted assemblies at which kings were made and unmade in terms of the selfsame Iranian discourse. Aristocrats convening to transcend their different interests, regions, backgrounds, and claims, collectively to acclaim a new ruler, did so in the name of the Iran, the Iranians. For as members of the mythical historical community, they exercised a shared collective sovereignty in their capacity to enthrone a king of kings, or for that matter, to dethrone a king of kings. In the course of the political history of the 3rd and 4th centuries, these institutions operated reliably in the service of the increasing cohesion of putatively Iranian aristocratic communities. The taking of Antioch and the capturing of a sitting Roman emperor in 260 CE, recounted in the inscription at Nakhshe-Rustam that I discussed a couple of weeks ago, was not the only triumph of the Iranian community in the 3rd century. Admittedly, the Iranian court suffered a shocking defeat in 298 when the Romans seized even the household of a king of kings, Narseh, and more problematically for an ideology of universal sovereignty, a strategic slice of Iranian territory, the fortified frontier city of Nisibis. Nevertheless, the reconquest of territory seems only to have galvanized aristocrats in support of the regime and increased the rate of campaigning, culminating in another Iranian victory in 363 CE that reestablishes a kind of parity along the Roman frontier that you see depicted here, an increasingly fortified Roman and Iranian frontier. The image, by the way, does not come from Nisibis, but rather from Amida, modern Diyarbakir, but an example of the increasing fortification and a kind of normalization of Roman-Iranian relations along this frontier you see roughly demarcated in black. Not until the Hun conquests of Central Asia in the late 4th century did the court face a major ideological challenge to its claim to dominate the known world. Similarly, the norms of succession defined at Paykuli, again, as I outlined in the last lecture, provided a durable basis for the aristocratic organization of the transfer of power between members of the Sasanian house for upward of 4 centuries. And here you have the continuity of Sasanian succession with only one exception in the year 590 to 591. Underpinning the stability of aristocratic support for the regime, I'll argue, was a Zoroastrian jurisprudential architecture that began to take shape precisely at the time of the emergence of the Iranian court in the early 3rd century. Here a figure that I mentioned in the first lecture returns to relevance. Kirdir, the chief Mobed, or chief Zoroastrian priest judge, under 4 successive Iranian rulers from Shapur I, whose reign begins in 240 CE, through Bahram II, whose reign ends in 293. So prominent was his role in the making of the regime that the court of Bahram II authorized him to carve his own image in the company of the first king of kings, Ardashir I, on his relief depicting the support of the deity Ormezd at Nakhshe-Rajab. He was, in his own self-representation and in the representation of the court, a primary architect of the reorganization of Zoroastrian institutions in the service of the regime. He gained the privilege not only of portraying himself among kings of kings, but also of providing his own account of his contributions to the early imperial project. And in this respect, he's entirely unique among non-royals in early Iranian political culture. That is, we have some non-royal inscriptions, but they are, to put it mildly, very, very brief. The two inscriptions he commissioned with the support of the court of Bahram II defined the content and normative boundaries of the Zoroastrian Dane with which the empire had been born. And I should clarify terminology here for those of you who were not in attendance at the first lecture, where I argued for the ancient emergence of a concept cognate with the modern term religion, a vision of bounded communities with clear boundaries between Christian, Manichaean, Buddhist, and Jewish communities. And that occurs precisely in this same inscription of Kirdir, where he uses the word Dane to speak of religion in those terms. The inscriptions also defined the powers Zoroastrian religious leaders were to wield within the new order, particularly in the domain of jurisprudence. Kirdir's intimacy with the kings of kings in the rock reliefs pointed to the exceptionally exalted political position of the chief Mobed in relation to other members of the court aristocracy. Under each sovereign, the inscriptions recounted, he becomes more powerful and more authoritative. Kamgartar and Padishaitar, the Middle Persian terms. Kamgar really just refers to powerful in our sense of the word, the ability to do what one wants, whereas Padishai refers to a recognized capacity to elicit assent, corresponding with our term authority, authoritative. Kirdir is best known for disciplining other religious communities in the empire, to use his term, striking Christians, Jews, Buddhists, Manichaeans, and others in supposedly persecutory episodes that I've elsewhere shown not to be as persecutory as they're typically described. Whether or not he actually instigated violence, the chief Mobed sought to define the superior position of the so-called good religion, the Vehdain, the current term for Zoroastrianism within his discourse, within the Iranian order, and to clarify the boundaries between different inferior Dane within the same space. Far more importantly, socially, economically, and politically, however, was the judicial power and authority that the early Iranian court invested in Kirdir and his fellow Mobed. He came to possess a supreme judicial office, authorizing him to sanction contracts, treaties, and judgments, and to employ seals to authenticate documents. The inscription here marks a dramatic innovation within the Zoroastrian jurisprudential tradition. Within textual corpora whose contents can be dated to the Parthian era at the latest, such as a text known as the Videv Dad, Zoroastrian priests regulated various aspects of human behavior with an eye toward ensuring the collective observation of norms of purity and morality. They contained an incipient jurisprudence, and according to priests, the capacity to regulate and to punish believers and potentially non-believers who violated their precepts. But what emerges over the course of the 3rd century, beginning in the inscriptions of Kirdir, is a qualitatively different, vastly more complex jurisprudential architecture taking shape from the tenure of Kirdir onward. Zoroastrian priests develop a hierarchy of judges, so-called dadwar, ranging from more localized to regional, the more localized Rad to regional Mobed, although there's wide chronological and regional variation in the ways these terms and others were employed. And we possess thousands of seals and bulai that document the activities of these Zoroastrian Mobed within juridical and administrative context more broadly. At the apex of the hierarchy stood the Mobedan Mobed, a title first attested in the 5th century that captured the supreme position that Kirdir already occupies in the 3rd. The decisions of this Mobedan Mobed were considered infallible, with the result that even judicial cases far from the domain of Dane, far from the domain of religion, from within the fiscal or military administration, for example, could come under the authority of the Zoroastrian Mobedan Mobed. There's one aspect of the image of Kirdir in this previous slide that I think is worth, that bears emphasis. Kirdir here wears what's called a kolah, typical aristocratic headgear. And this is a reminder of how completely Zoroastrian religious authorities identified with the aristocratic Iranian community. They were one and the same. There is no distinction between religious authority and aristocratic authority in the self-understanding of these Zoroastrian jurists and priests. The jurisprudential system the Mobed proceeded to develop emerges in its fullness only in the course of the 5th, 6th, and 7th centuries, and really, especially in the early 7th century, in a corpus of judicial decisions known as the Thousand Judgments. The text dates to the early 7th century, but is based on earlier decisions. The editor of the text collects individual cases that were considered worthy of reflection and debate, a kind of handbook for jurists at work. The bulk of the named judges date to the 5th and 6th century, and the echoes of the system within contemporary Armenian and East Syrian Christian texts demonstrate that the fundamental institutions were already in widespread operation in the 4th and 5th centuries. An ever-increasing corpus of documentary texts, moreover, reveals that these institutions had already come to shape the everyday life of communities across the empire, even in comparatively remote parts of the Caspian. The Thousand Judgments is a frustrating read for historians trained in more familiar jurisprudential systems, such as Roman law, given the almost monomaniacal focus of the jurists on questions of reproduction. If I were to give you a statistic, it would not be particularly precise, but about 70 or 80% of the context of this work are concerned with marriage and reproduction. Criminal law appears only kind of haphazardly. It's not a primary concern whatsoever for the jurists. Their juridical obsession addressed a problem of political urgency, mortality, specifically the mortality of Iranian aristocratic males. The regime constituted nothing more and nothing less than a network of aristocratic houses, organized along patrilineal lines of descent, on whom the court depended for its military power. The Iranian discourse identifying these patrilineages with their ancient mythical forebearers of the Avesta as Iranians also necessitated their individual reproduction. According to Zoroastrian cosmology, each individual Iranian line was to be perpetuated eternally, and a man who did not produce a male heir famously could not pass over the Chinvad Bridge into paradise. The ideological program of the court entailed a normative framework according to which each aristocratic patrilineage had to be reproduced. Such cosmological principles also served to guarantee the continuity of the individual components of the military power of the regime, the great aristocratic houses. And the great aristocrats of the Iranian age were as vulnerable to death and disappearance as the common laborers over whom they dominated. The patrilineal foundations of the Iranian regime were, in the absence of artificial institutional development, as frail as any human body. This was a predicament elite communities defining themselves through patrilineages had long shared across Eurasia, especially in the Imperial Iron Age, and would continue to do so into the beginnings of modernity. Comparative demographers have documented striking commonalities across different pre-modern cultures and environments. Staggeringly high rates of infant and adolescent mortality spared neither commoners nor elites. The causes of premature death, disease, and sanitation stalked humans of all ranks and environments. And the comparative advantage of the superior nourishment available to elite children seems to have played only a marginal role in surviving adolescence. The most thoroughly studied demographic regime of the pre-modern world conforms with what can be known, in broad outlines, of other regions and eras. In the Roman Empire, an average life expectancy of between 20 and 25 years constrained women to achieve the remarkable reproductive success of producing 5 or 6 children within their childbearing years, simply to maintain demographic stability. Fewer than 50% of these children would manage to survive adolescence. The upshot of these figures is that men, whether elites or commoners, had a roughly 2 in 3 chance of producing a male heir. If anything, the demographic data from pre-modern Iran suggests an even starker rate of mortality, with as few as 40% of children reaching adolescence and an average life expectancy perhaps as low as 15 years. The underdevelopment of pre-modern Middle Eastern demographics nevertheless suggests caution in embracing these starker figures. And the Roman evidence provides only working guidelines for hypothetically reconstructing the demographic landscape of the empire. Within these conditions, an Iranian aristocratic patrilineage could expect to endure for no more than 3 generations. Of course, the routine solution in the Iron Age was something like unconstrained polygyny, for elite males. This generated political problems of its own. The overproduction of heirs in the dynastic political cultures of the Middle East after Alexander famously played a crucial role in the unceasing internecine violence of the Hellenistic era. The Iranian constraint on polygyny nevertheless came from a different cultural direction and interestingly conforms with contemporary tendencies toward monogamy in the Mediterranean world, although I would not argue for a cultural cross-pollination. Throughout the Zoroastrian literature of the Iranian era, there are few concepts as vexing and controversial as khvedoda. Literally translated as the giving of oneself, the term designated a peculiarly Zoroastrian cosmological understanding of endogamy. It's routinely described in scholarly literature simply as incest, and not without reason. According to the mythical genealogies elaborated in the Iranian era, which you have depicted here, humanity originated in the incestuous union between the deity Ormazd and his daughter Spandarmad, and the first man, Gaiomard, fathered a son and daughter with his own mother, who continued the pattern of incestuous marriage to produce the forefathers of the Iranians. Ancient and modern observers alike have shared a horror at the Zoroastrian celebration of close-kin marriage. One can find critics of, quote, Persian perversity as far afield as Korea in the first millennium within Buddhist communities, as well as along the frontiers of the Roman world. They had no reason to fear the influence of so-called Persian perversities. The priest scholars enjoined the practice only on those patrilineages considered cosmically beneficent, namely those of the so-called Iranians, with the aim of maintaining the exclusivity of their cosmic genealogies. Marriages of the most proximate kin, mothers and sons, fathers and daughters, brothers and sisters, appear as utterly banal in the Thousand Judgments and throughout Zoroastrian literature, including in some of the recently published documentary texts. The principle of Kherodah, however, involved a much wider range of endogamous marriage than simply the unions most shocking to the ancients and shocking to us. Zoroastrian thinkers characterized both close relations, nazd-paiwand, and closer relations, nazd-paiwandtar, as forms of Kherodah, encompassing unions generally more common across the pre-modern and modern world, such as those between cousins, as well as those that we would characterize more explicitly as incestuous. What is more, and I think this is much more important, Zoroastrian jurists successfully uncoupled biological relatedness from genealogy and personal identity through a variety of forms of artificial kinship, as I'll describe momentarily. It's perfectly possible that the great bulk, and perhaps even all, of the participants in so-called close-kin Kherodah marriages were not, in fact, biologically related. The principle of Kherodah places the burden of elite reproduction on aristocratic women, and this is a defining feature of the Iranian jurisprudential system. It imposed a constraint on the reproductive opportunities of aristocratic males, precisely those patrilineages whose perpetuation is so fundamental to the Iranian political project. It also presented opportunities for the consolidation of aristocratic power that the Zoroastrian jurist would realize in the decades and centuries following the rise of the chief Mobed to a position of juridical supremacy. Before turning to their institutions, It's worth dwelling for a moment on the women who provided the foundation for the juridical edifice that they would erect, within what I call a regime of reproductive coercion. The jurists required women to begin childbearing as soon as they became pubescent. The recommended age for marriage ranged from 9 to 14, several years to a decade earlier than their counterparts in the contemporary Roman Empire or ancient Mesopotamia. Neither marriage nor childbearing were optional. The refusal to marry with the goal of reproduction constituted a so-called margarzon sin, a crime literally worthy of death, although one can doubt whether jurists in every instance actually applied the letter of the law. And widows are required to remarry rapidly after the death of their husbands. And as I'll explain in a moment, there's also enormous pressure on the wives of men, for example, who are on military campaigns away from home for extended periods of time, to contract temporary marriages so that their reproductive capacities are almost always in use. Abortion continually recurs as among the most heinous acts imaginable within Zoroastrian discourse, alongside homosexual sex. The jurists aimed to enlist as many aristocratic female wombs as possible in the labor of reproduction throughout their lifetimes. This regime of reproductive coercion may have yielded significant reproductive advantages, as even a slightly lower average age of first marriage could have substantially increased the rate of fertility, the only factor actually in reproductive success on which the jurists could have had any influence. The impact on the women themselves, however, would have been far less favorable. The still only suggestive osteological evidence from the Iranian world points in the direction of a mortality rate for women during their childbearing years, twice that of men. The Iranian regime of reproductive coercion enabled the jurists to resolve the contradiction between their two seemingly incompatible principles: maintaining endogamy on the one hand and maximizing the reproductive fitness of elite males on the other. The tension between these two imperatives forms the space in which jurists experimented and innovated an array of new juridical institutions aimed at providing stability to the inherent frailty of a political order built on individual patrilineages. Endogamy's restricting the pool of available women to the daughters, wives, and mothers of fellow aristocrats inspired the first of these institutions that I will address: temporary marriage, an institution that continues to play a role in contemporary Iran, of course not only in Iran, in its Shiite form, as I'm sure many of you are aware. In the Thousand Judgments, marriages contracted for a fixed duration are ubiquitous and fundamental to the operation of all other institutions of reproduction. They're so banal as to merit not a single sentence of theoretical reflection. They're just taken for granted as what one does. There are two fundamental forms of marriage in Iranian jurisprudence, and both could be organized temporarily. The padishah, or authoritative marriage, in which wife and children are regarded as the legitimate heirs of the male head of household, and the chagar, or auxiliary or temporary marriage, in which neither the wife nor the offspring could stand as heirs. And I'll explain whose heirs they typically become momentarily. Auxiliary marriages serve to produce an heir on behalf of another man, typically already deceased, and therefore are almost always temporary in union, often 1 year in duration, enough to bear a child. But the jurists empowered elite males to contract any union for any period beyond the minimum of the 1 year required for reproduction. So they could have as many temporary and padishah marriages as they liked at the same time, although there is a tendency, it's not demonstrable, but it's a tendency toward monogamy with respect to the padishah wife. The wombs of aristocratic women were thus made available on contractual terms to a potentially much wider array of aristocratic men than their primary authoritative husbands. And women were expected to have remarried multiple times in the course of their fertility, often while remaining married to their primary padishah husband. These temporary contracts, for example, allowed men to give their padishah wives in a chagar, temporary marriage, to another man for a fixed period. Such occasions would have occurred frequently within highly mobile Iranian aristocratic communities. And as I'll explain toward the end of my talk today, they increasingly are campaigning at great distances from their patrimonial estates, from their families, for extended periods of time, often for years at a time. And it's in such circumstances that contracting a chagar marriage for your wife in your absence might be advantageous. Time, of course, is no trivial resource in the matter of fertility. What the combination of endogamy and temporary marriage made possible was nothing less than the conquest of death. The jurists achieved this victory through an institution known as sturi. Substitute successorship, I think, is the most appropriate translation into English. That is to say, a man can stand as the substitute successor for a man who's already deceased. And in fact, a woman may do so as well. Both men and women can be stur within this institution. In the case of a death of a man with no son, the substitute successor, or stur, stands in the place of the legitimate male heir, making arrangements for the production of a son and the protection of the patrimony until the son attains maturity. With its aim of producing a male heir for the sonless deceased, sturi resembles other ancient institutions, most obviously Jewish levirate marriage. And indeed, contemporary Christians in the Iranian Empire will recover the levirate marriage from the Hebrew Bible and adapt it to their own purposes in order to imitate what Zoroastrian jurists are doing with this institution of sturi. But substitute successorship was far more complex and flexible and could serve to guarantee the production of a male heir in all imaginable contexts of aristocratic death. The stur need not be genealogically related to the deceased, even if, in normal cases, they were drawn from among close kin. A man could designate a stur of his own in his testament. This could be literally any other Iranian aristocrat. But most importantly, juridical authorities independent of the house could appoint a stur, a substitute successor, in the absence of a so-called natural or designated substitute successor, a so-called sturi gumardag. To communicate the range of possibilities, let's imagine a hypothetical scenario. In fact, a scenario that we know in its broad outlines, to have played out pretty commonly in the Iranian world in these centuries. An Iranian aristocrat from Khorasan, looking something along the lines of the character that you see here, let's call him Karen Gushnasp, embarks on a military campaign against the Huns, together with his father, brothers, and uncles. An entirely reasonable scenario to imagine, as patrilineal communities operated as units of cataphract field armies. So members of the same patrilineage will fight alongside one another. Karen Gushnasp perishes in battle, together with all of his patrilineal relatives. And to make matters worse, the Huns enter Khorasan and destroy the aristocratic estates of their Iranian enemies as they march toward the royal road leading to Mesopotamia. Such events became practically routine in the course of the late 4th and 5th centuries. Karen Gushnasp therefore dies with no male heir. Even if he had made contractual arrangements for a substitute successor, the documents would have gone up in flames with the destruction of his estate. So what happens to his line? The regional Zoroastrian judge, the Mobed, would appoint a stur on behalf of Karen Gushnasp. A stur totally unrelated to the deceased, who would then proceed to contract a marriage for a temporary period of duration of, as we know, at least a year, enabling the production not of one or two children, but of several, with the goal of guaranteeing the survival of a male heir and the continuation of the lineage. We can imagine an even more extreme scenario. What if the local juridical authorities also disappear? What if the local Mobed also is killed in the course of these Hun conquests? The Iranian court we know to have maintained careful documentation of each patrilineage, presumably in conjunction with its military roles. And in reviewing the list of deceased combatants, would recognize the end of a line. The King of Kings himself is the final guarantor of the institution of substitute successorship, the final guarantor of each male patrilineage, the redundancy of each patrilineage. If the end of a line became known to the court, it was the King of Kings' obligation to appoint a stour on his behalf. And the court is even in charge with organizing loans from the royal domain, the so-called dastgird, if the surviving patrimony of the deceased was insufficient to meet the minimum income requirements for a stouree. Remember, the stour's responsibility is also to tutor the children who are born into adulthood, into the age of maturity, which is 15 years old. Right? So this is a complex institution that requires substantial funding, and the king's estate is itself the final source of such funding in extremis. The Iranian court, in other words, came to guarantee the perpetuation of each Iranian aristocratic patrilineage. The 6th and 7th century material illustrates the ubiquity of these institutions across a wide range of regions and contexts, and presupposes the proliferation of temporary marriage and substitute successorship in the course of the preceding centuries. This is true not only of the juridical corpus of the Thousand Judgments, but also of documentary texts, such as recently published archives from 7th century Tabaristan and the Caspian. The aristocratic communities of the early Iranian Empire embraced Zoroastrian juridical institutions with apparent enthusiasm, taking full advantage of the opportunities the jurists provided to guarantee the social and political positions of their lineages across generations. And each time they turned to the court's Zoroastrian juridical apparatus, they perform their Iranian identity. Qualifying as Iran was a prerequisite for access to specifically Zoroastrian institutions such as stouree. Even if Jews and Christians and others could turn to the court of a mobed for other more mundane matters, institutions such as stouree are specifically limited only to members of the Iranian community, that is to say, Zoroastrian aristocrats. And the Iranian discourse permeates the Thousand Judgments and associated texts. I'd like to return here to a theme of the first lecture, the situational nature of the Iranian identity that the 3rd century court pitched as a novel means of representing oneself within the context of collective political action. One was not Iranian all day, every day. This has nothing like modern national identities. One was Iranian in the context of military campaigns against the Romans, or in the act of acclaiming a ruler, or in dethroning another. These were exceptional circumstances, and our working assumption should be that these aristocrats primarily represented themselves in regional and genealogical terms across more conventional circumstances, as we know to be the case among the admittedly better documented aristocrats of the Caucasus. The deployment of Iranian identities in jurisprudential contexts, however, brought this discourse into the quotidian, even rendering self-identification as Iranian an indispensable component of aristocratic portfolios of identity. The continual reminder of one's Iranianness in everyday documentary acts, and especially at the most momentous junctures of life, marriage, death, inheritance, brings a discourse of collective political action into the personal domestic sphere of the house and the household. The significance of the Iranian identity resided not in any inward self-reflection, which we have to admit would be unrecoverable in any case from ancient contexts, but in its practical utility, its capacity to empower the aristocrats who adopted its terms, and also at the same time to empower the court. Iranian juridical institutions empowered aristocrats and the court not only through their provision of guaranteed reproduction, but also through the entangling of individual lineages within an ever larger network of aristocratic houses identifiable as Iranian. Stouree, or substitute successorship, involved alliance as well as reproduction. With the establishment of a substitute successor, there are two opportunities to consolidate relations either inside or outside the house. The appointment of the steward, who serves as the substitute successor, and the appointment of a spouse, the choice of a wife who will bear the child or children. So-called natural substitute successors necessarily married men who were not descendants of the deceased, either patrilineal relatives or members of an entirely unrelated lineage. Designated or appointed substitute successors could be either patrilateral, or totally unrelated. The institution precipitated the unusual circumstances in which a significant number of aristocratic males, at least 1/3, but likely many, many more, were raised as the legitimate male heirs of their fathers who were long deceased, and are raised by their biological parents, to whom they were juridically and spiritually speaking totally unrelated. The problem of children born in auxiliary marriages recurs throughout the Thousand Judgments. Parents wanted to adopt them as sons and daughters. They wanted to enlist them as their own substitute successors and make them legitimate heirs. And of course, the jurists have to foreclose all of these possibilities in order to maintain the functionality of the institution of stewardship. This is a kind of common sense insight that, parents usually have some affection toward their children and vice versa, which of course is a long debate in the history of pre-modern childhood, where there's a recent argument of Kyle Harper, which is sort of obvious to me, but the argument has had to be made that there are natural limits on artificial kinship, that with biological parents and children cultivating totally unsurprising ties of intimacy. Devised within an endogamous framework, substitute successorship generated a potentially vast array of social bonds with those outside of the house or the household. Even in the process of guaranteeing patrilineal descent, the institution fosters the development of lateral relations through which aristocratic networks consisting of multiple houses could be established and maintained across Iran's disparate territories. If in the 3rd century, the shared genealogy of the Iranians was a matter of myth, a mere proposition, the Iranian juridical complex rendered ever-increasing numbers of aristocratic houses interrelated through ties of biological or fictive kinship. The Iranian aristocratic community increasingly became a single genealogical network in practice as well as in theory. The catastrophic political events of the late 4th century will only have enhanced the appeal of the Iranian jurisprudential complex to aristocratic communities. The arrival for the first time of nomads aspiring to create empires in West Asia, of the kind their predecessors had been forming for upward of 6 centuries along the Eurasian grasslands of China, posed an entirely unforeseeable existential threat to the regime. Beginning in the 350s, groups calling themselves Huns, who would come to depict themselves in images such as the one you see on this coin, they call themselves Huns in a deliberate evocation of the Xiongnu Empire that had dominated the East Asian grasslands from 209 BCE to the late 1st century CE. And they would conquer Iran's Central Asian territories, including the resource-rich regions of Sogdia, Bactria, and Gandhara. That's the shaded area here, if I can. It's the shaded area that you see here, corresponding to modern Pakistan, Afghanistan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan. These conquests put into question the mythical, historical, universal sovereignty at the core of the Iranian ideological program. It also put the lives of aristocratic males at unprecedented risk. For the first time, the late 4th and 5th century court had to enlist aristocrats in multi-year campaigns to prevent further conquests and, in due time, to attempt the reconquest of Central Asia. No longer would aristocrats return to their ancestral patrimonies, to their families, at the end of a summertime campaigning program, or campaigning season, What I characterized in the last lecture as recreational warfare against the Romans gives way to campaigns of unrelenting bloodshed, with aristocrats housed for years, sometimes together with the kings of kings, in newly constructed complexes of walls and fortified settlements at the frontiers, such as, this is the, well, I didn't realize that was also a power button. Oh wait, I don't have to touch anything. Okay. So up here, this is an image of the wall of Birkbeck in Dagestan, which is the most impressive of these surviving monuments. These complexes here in the Caucasus and also in the frontiers of Khorasan are characterized by contemporary aristocrats as cages, as prisons, to capture the trauma of having to remain at the frontier campaigning continuously for years instead of returning to one's ancestral estates. And the extent to which in contemporary texts they romanticize those estates, romanticize their grassland, their region, their wives, their families, is really quite remarkable. There's an entirely new configuration, politically speaking, that takes shape in the 5th century. A late Iranian text, the History of Zarer, gave voice to aristocratic anxieties in the course of their combat with the nomads in a typically mythical historical fashion, modeling Iranian aristocrats on their mythical predecessors. There would be many mothers without sons, many sons without fathers, many fathers without sons, many brothers without brothers, and many married women without husbands. In this account, the King of Kings assuages aristocratic fears with a promise to die himself, if necessary, together with all of his descendants to defend Iran. And indeed, at least one Iranian ruler did just that, Perros in 484. And the stories of entire aristocratic cavalry armies disappearing in the course of these conflicts with the Huns are so common as to capture a degree of the violence that the Huns were able to inflict with vastly superior military technology with which the Iranians had had no familiarity prior to their first encounter. The jurisprudential architecture of the Zoroastrian jurists nevertheless provided far more reassurance to the aristocrats of late 4th through 5th centuries than the sentimental gesture of a king of kings willing to die himself. The regime guaranteed the perpetuation of their patrilineages as long as they prevent the conquering of the empire, irrespective of the number of deaths in battle or months spent away from their families and their wives. On November 16th, we'll see how the regime simultaneously guaranteed their landed patrimonies across the empire. Thank you for your time, and I have, as promised, concluded earlier than I did in the first lecture, where I had to front load some material. So we have ample time for questions, which I would be happy to address.